This is the Angel Next Door podcast, where we will talk about all things angel investing, what it is, who does it, how do we find them, what does it mean to invest in an early stage company. If you have ever wondered how you can affect the change you want to see in the world, then tune in to learn more. Hi, everyone. In today's episode, I'm talking with my friend and fellow ACA board member and previous ACA chair, Tony Shipley. Tony is the founder of Queen City Angels, QCA, as we call it, in Cincinnati, an angel group that has been growing and thriving for over 20 years. Recently, there were two big exits at QCA, which led many of the QCA members to develop a better understanding of how some of the tax incentives angel investors and entrepreneurs receive for taking early risks. Tony and I will discuss how they work and how these incentives help bring more capital into the overall entrepreneurial ecosystems around the country, helping to drive more of the change we want to see in the world. I love talking about exits, so this is an episode you won't want to miss. Enjoy the show. Well, hi, Tony. Welcome to the show.
Marcia, nice to be with you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, I'm really excited to have you on. For our listeners, Tony and I have been on the board of the Angel Capital Association together now for, I think it's over 7 years. And Tony was the chair of the board before I became the chair in 2021. So we've had a lot of time that we've been trying to do all kinds of things to get angel investing out into the world and get more people to know about it. So I'm super excited to have you on today and tell us about your journey. So why don't we start by telling us, how did you even learn about angel investing and how did you get to be where you are now?
Again, Marcia, thank you for inviting me, and thanks so much for all your contributions to ACA. And you're right, we've had an interesting journey together. Going back to my time in how I started angel investing, I spent almost 25 years setting up businesses and running those businesses and getting to successful exits. And the last business was one that we needed a lot of outside capital to get to the point that we were trying to move the business to. And in that process, I ended up working with venture capitalists and learned that whole process of how VCs do everything they do, from assessing a deal to writing term sheets to writing the documentation to paper the deal and post-investment governance, and the list goes on. But in that whole process, what I discovered was if you were a high technology company located any place other than the East Coast or the West Coast, it was really hard for these kinds of companies to go out and raise capital to grow their business. So once I sold the last company, I thought it would be a perfect time to think about how to pay it forward in our community, because I'd spent basically all my time doing two things. That was developing and running the business, and then time with my family. But I thought this would be a great time to think about how I could help the local community. And we looked around for ways that we could invest in startup organizations. And at that time, there were probably 30 or 40 angel groups around the country. And I ended up contacting 2 or 3 of those: Boston group, California group, and North Carolina group. And they were really generous in terms of sharing with me everything that they had done to set their angel group up, including recruiting members, how they found deal flow, how they assessed deals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we made a decision that we would set up an angel group in Cincinnati, which was really the first group within about 300 or 400 miles of Cincinnati. It was not a popular thing to do from an asset class standpoint at that time. So we looked at all those best practices that other groups had, picked out the best parts that met what we were trying to do, filled in the blanks, and then created our groups going back to 2000 with 5 people. To fast forward, we've built our group today to more than 180 members. We've invested in about 110 different companies with almost 300 rounds of capital, and many hundreds of millions of dollars have been invested in those companies. So thus far, it's been a good ride.
Wow. 110 companies. And so QCA the angel group is called Queen City Angels. We call it QCA
Correct.
for
Yes.
short. So you started it in 2000, right?
Yes, we did.
And so you've invested in over 110 companies. So when you say we, who was it that started it with you?
I had worked at a technology company when I moved to Cincinnati way back when. I won't tell you the year because it obviously dates me, and 4 other people from that company ended up retiring when that company was purchased by EDS in 2000. It was one of our first unicorns in the region. Actually, it was purchased for $1 billion. But I had left a long time before that. The 5 of us got together, started having lunch, and started talking about deal flow. It was just the height of the .com bubble, all kinds of activity going on, and we even caught the .com bubble here in Cincinnati. So there were lots of people with interesting ideas floating around, and we decided that we would start looking at those companies and ultimately decide to go ahead and invest in some of them. So 5 of us, and that first year, it grew really quickly. I think we were at 19 or 20 members, and we did 7 deals in year 1 and put about $3.5 million of money to work pretty quickly. And then all kinds of things happened, 9/11, the 2003 market issue, blah, blah, blah. But by about 2005, 2006, it became obvious that we really needed to crank up everything that we were doing in our local community because the ecosystem started to develop. And I won't go into all those details, but locally in Cincinnati and here in Ohio, lots of interesting things had happened to build more entrepreneurial kinds of businesses, which of course gave us some unique investment opportunities during that time period. And then that one thing led to another. And then about 6 years or 7 years ago, we went through an extensive strategic planning session in our angel group. And one of the things that came out of that was learning why a lot of local people had not elected to be in the asset class. And so we decided that we needed to set up a new class of membership that we could bring people in that would invest a fraction of what our normal regular members were investing. But we could also wrap some education around that to help people understand what is this angel investing asset class? How do I do it? And how can I ease into this in a more reasonable manner as opposed to what the expectations were for our regular members. And so doing that led to lots of people joining what we now call our Ascent program. And that has been a phenomenal growth engine for us and helped us get up to this 180 plus members that we have today.
I absolutely love that because, you and I have talked at length about we need to get more people to know about this asset class and to get more comfortable with it. But it isn't something that you just jump into and you want to put tons of money behind when you don't really know much about it or you've never done it before. And you kind of want to watch other people do it and see what's out there. Of course, every company sounds amazing when you first hear them pitch, which I remember when I was a new angel, I was like, oh, I love that idea. It's fantastic. I have to invest in it. And then realized that there's a lot of issues there. So definitely something to definitely get educated on ahead of time. But I love how QCA has evolved into having the Ascent program, which is for newer angels or people who are looking to get a little more education and have an easier way to get into the asset class. But QCA started as what we would consider to be an angel network, meaning that you would pool money together from different people who'd write a check into an individual company. But then you graduated into more of a fund model. When did that happen?
Yeah, that goes back to 2003. And I mentioned a moment ago some of the things that had happened in the state of Ohio that really helped us grow the entire ecosystem throughout the state. One of those was a program called the Ohio Third Frontier Program. And they decided that they would give a certain amount of money from that program to organizations like Queen City Angels and others throughout the state that were investing in early stage companies. They would actually grant money to us if we would match it with a certain match number. And what they wanted us to do was to invest in what I call napkin stage deals. These are 2 people in a garage or a basement with an idea. In many cases, not even a minimally viable product, but they need enough money to scrape together that minimally viable product, go out and do some market research, et cetera, et cetera. And then if they hit some reasonable metric, they could come back to our group and get funding, which is really what we were looking for. So it turned out to be a way to have a farm system for our angel group. And the state did one round of that. They came back and did another round. And these were all set up in funds. And by the time they did the third round, it had become a bigger activity. The first couple of rounds were $1.5 million funds. The third round was a $4 million fund. The fourth round that they did was an $8 million fund. And the fifth round was a $10 million fund with equal parts coming from our angel group and from the state. And that's how we basically morphed into this notion of a hybrid group, still have the network, but supplement that with a family of funds. And our sixth fund, which we started 4 years ago, it's really the biggest of all of our funds at $23 million. And it's allowed us to do a lot more interesting things in terms of investing and grow outside our local regional activities into more national activities.
That is awesome. And, I've been on the podcast before talking about how important diversification is. So I'm a big fan of allowing members to participate in a fund and be able to put in extra money into the deals that they really like. So I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about how you decided how you would do the fund versus the network.
The reason that the funds became so important in our group was that people realized the need for diversification. So how do you get that diversification? You can piece together your own portfolio, which will probably take a 3 or 4 or 5 year period. And you probably want to target 15 to 20 companies. And if you look at any of the empirical data from all the different angel sources that we have today, educational sources, that's probably the size portfolio that one would need to get the appropriate adjusted risk factors built in. But people said, I want that instant diversification. And so they became more acclimated to investing in funds because they could get that diversification. And then when the company was doing well and they came back for additional rounds of capital, we always had a little bit of dry powder that we had reserved in the fund, but it also gave members an opportunity to write those sidecar checks, and hence the reason that we continued to have our network group working in parallel with our fund activity.
That's awesome. Oh, we have a new term. Anytime we talk about something that's an angel term, I always want to explain to our listeners what that means. So explain dry powder.
Yeah, dry powder. It's we make that initial investment in a company. And the one thing that we've absolutely learned over the years of making these investments, it's almost never a one and done proposition. They're going to come back for additional rounds of capital. And at some point, we either want them to get maybe a VC round or hopefully go through an M&A process where we can exit the company. But after we make that initial investment, we'd have to reserve follow-on capital because, as I said a moment ago, we realize they're going to be coming back to us to get growth capital to take the company to the next level and the next level. And each of those levels requires additional capital. So we have to reserve some money, hence the term dry powder.
Yeah, that's awesome. And, as an angel investor, I think it took me several years to realize just what it meant to say that it is really hard to grow a startup company. People would say to me, it's really hard to grow a startup company. I'm like, yeah, it's really hard. But I didn't truly understand what that meant until I became an angel investor and was walking alongside of these companies for a while and realizing how many times they needed to hit a milestone, get more money, hit another milestone, get more money. And you hope that that's how it happens and they don't kind of run out of money along the way.
Exactly.
So let's talk about fun things like exits. QCA has had several exits in the past, but 2 in particular that just coincidentally happened to be announced on the same day. So tell us a little about that.
Yeah, that was a total unique, pleasant experience, to say the least. We had invested in a company about 5.5 years ago that was a SaaS company, and they had a supply chain solution. It was really a unique set of circumstances which the entrepreneur came to us. It was a kind of a buyback of technology, and we ended up funding the company with one round of capital. I think it was $2 million that went into the business. And the company started to get instant traction. And they actually, through the money they had, through the investments that we made, plus the revenue that they were generating through just ordinary contracts, they managed to be able to grow that business without an additional round of capital. And then with all the supply chain issues that we have seen around the globe, this became a really hot topic. And so a number of companies approached our portfolio company and said, we really need to bolt your technology onto what we have to have a more complete solution in the marketplace. And so the company hired an investment banking firm, went through that whole process, which went pretty quickly. I think the whole process was a 2 to 3 month kind of a deal. They got down to the last 2 or 3 companies, did a kind of an auction process, picked the final bidder, and within 6 days, believe it or not, they had actually closed the deal. The good news about that deal was, as I said a moment ago, we were in this 5.5 years. And that triggered a really important concept for a QSBS company. That means a qualified small business stock. And to be a company that is a QSBS company, it has to be an investment in an equity, and it has to be an investment that you have held for at least a 5-year period. There's some other qualifications, but those are the 2 main ones. And because we've been in the business for that 5.5-year period, it triggered the use of tax code 1202, which is essentially a tax code that allows us to have a transaction with no federal tax on the transaction. And depending on the state that you're in, it could also be exempt from a state tax standpoint. Unfortunately, we don't have that feature in Ohio, but other states do. So what this really means is that the investors as well, and this is a very important point, as well as that management team, the entrepreneur and the management team were all able to participate in that investment or that exit on a tax-free basis. Really, really big deal.
That is a big deal. And I don't think very many people know that is even in existence in our tax code.
Yeah, Marcia, that's a really important point. And a lot of us, especially group leaders, have talked about this notion of 1202 and QSBS companies for a long time. But most members don't really grasp what that notion is until you go through it. And once you actually go through the process and you see, oh my goodness, I'm just making up a number here. I made a $25,000 investment. I get a $100,000 check back, and guess what? I get to keep it all. That is really impactful. And when people see that that's the way it works, there's a lot of buzz and excitement around these kinds of investments. And so I think you're right. And I think overall, we probably, as an industry, need to do a better job at educating not only the investors, but as I said, also the management teams of these companies, the importance of QSBS stock.
Yeah. And if we could just go back for a second and talk about why it's allowed, angel investments from the investor side, and then also the risk that entrepreneurs take from the opportunity cost side of what, they could go out and get a stable job with lots of good perks like health insurance and things like that. But what do? They go out and they do something that's risky. And the investors at the very early stage are also risky. So QSBS is really there to help make sure that the risk is rewarded and that people will keep doing it. Because if too many people become too risk averse, they will not want to do this. Would you agree?
I couldn't agree more. And as a recovering entrepreneur and having gone through those exits and having to write that big check to the government when you have an exit, you kind of scratch your head and think, you know what, I spent 10 years or 15 years or whatever of my life building this business and taking all these enormous risks. And then creating, in our case, we created hundreds of jobs, and then having to give up part of that to pay taxes. That didn't seem quite fair, but it was what it was at the time. But to your point, when these entrepreneurs can spend 5 years or 8 years or 10 years or whatever of their life putting together these successful businesses, and they end up getting a $5 million or an $8 million or $10 million or whatever it is dollar check, and they can keep that check, it's a clear message to them. You've done it once, you had a successful exit, think about doing this again. So I think it can be a contributor to us getting recycled entrepreneurs, bringing that next big idea to the marketplace. And then in terms of on the investor side, It helps us think about how to recycle more dollars back into the community. And more dollars, rather than paying that tax bill, it gives us more money that we can recycle into those new businesses.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the whole point is if you're making a return on the capital that you just put into a company, well, there's so many more companies out there that need our help. And if we can just keep that cycle going, that's awesome.
Absolutely. And I'm a big fan of that. And we'll talk in just a moment, hopefully, about the ACA's impact or influence on QSBS and 1202.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get there, let's hear about the other exit that happened. It was a 9-figure exit, if I'm right.
Yeah, and in fact, the number was printed in the press, in a news release. It was potentially a $300 million exit, which we were absolutely excited over. The difference in the first company that I just described and the second company was when we made the initial investment in the second company, it was made in the form of a convertible note. And after a couple of years, the company did a Series A round, and where they brought the VCs in, it was a medical device company, so they needed some big checks, and we worked with them to bring VCs in to fund the company. But when we did that conversion, or when the VCs made that investment, it triggered a conversion from that convertible note to equity in the business. And looking at how long the clock ran on that equity investment, it was about a 4.5-year period. So we're sitting here scratching our head thinking, oh my goodness, we have just missed QSBS by 6 months. And of course, that was top of mind because we had this SaaS company that had exited. We knew the impact of QSBS and 1202 on the potential returns. And we're sitting there scratching our head thinking, oh my goodness, we're going to miss on this medical device company by 6 months. So we started looking at other ways that we could think about this exit. And lo and behold, there's a thing called a 1045. And what that means is that if you exit one QSBS company and you can repurpose those dollars into another QSBS company, and do that within a 60-day window of the exit time from the first company, guess what? You get to keep the company or the clock ticking on that investment. And as long as you keep that money in the new company for at least a 6-month period, that you can then treat that money as a QSBS qualified investment. And if the company exited within, say, as an example, 1 year from the time you roll your money over into the new company, that then qualifies as a 1202 type of exit and hence a tax-free exit. Very important tax code concept.
Wow. I had known a little bit about it from kind of hearing these things, but all of the rules around it are very interesting. And as people who are listening become angel investors or work with different groups, they will obviously find out more details. But this is so important for people to know because, and it's also a great way to, again, like we just talked about, encourage people to keep the cycle going, keep putting more money into helping these early stage companies.
I absolutely totally agree with that. And in our case, because of the deal flow that we had on the table at the time, we ended up giving our investors 5 or 6 different options that they could roll the money into. It was either companies that we had in the short term funded or previously just within the last couple of months had funded. They still had open rounds, but we also had 2 or 3 other deals that we were looking at that were approved deals. So it ended up giving our investors a smorgasbord of companies that they could look at and then pick from that companies that they might want to roll the money into, one or more of those companies actually, to get this 1045 treatment of the money, which hopefully will lead to 1202 treatment when they do the ultimate exit of those companies that they roll the money into. So absolutely very important concept.
And I do love how the founders and the management team get to participate in this as well, because, we talk all the time about you're usually betting on the jockey, not the horse, meaning that somebody could have a really phenomenal idea, great business, but if you don't have the right team to take it all the way to the finish line, that can be obviously very problematic. And what we really want as investors is to bet on the team that has the experience and that's done it before. So really being able to encourage these amazing entrepreneurs to keep creating and producing these incredible companies is what we really want.
Yeah, just really quickly, and to that point, one of the founders of one of the companies that we're just talking about is actually taking a sizable chunk of his exit money and putting into a new company that will be focused on developing numerous medical device companies going forward. So here's a way that an entrepreneur who is an MD, by the way, is going to recycle some of the money into new startup organizations, and then he's going to be actively involved in some of these as an entrepreneur, as a founder, and or as a coach to these incoming new entrepreneurs. So I think it's going to end up being a win-win-win for everyone, including the overall community.
Oh, God, that's so great. I love that. So it seems that the work that the ACA has been doing to help make sure that these things are kind of kept in place from a legislative standpoint has been a little bit like a best kept secret. So maybe tell us a little bit more about how the ACA does that.
Yeah, just before we get to that point, just one other quick thing, Marcia. There's also a tax code called 1244, and 1244 says that up to some level, if you make an investment in a company and the company doesn't succeed, you can write that off as an ordinary loss. I know today's session isn't to get into that, but that's something for people to keep in mind as they make these investments, and for whatever reason the company doesn't make it, there is that other third tax feature called the 1244. But to come back to your question, and I think you hit the nail on the head, there's a lot of folks that are members of the ACA that on a surface level anyway, have heard about things that we do from a public policy perspective. But probably going back 12 or 13 or 14 years ago, the people that were on the board at ACA at that time decided that we really needed to start to lobby for tax code improvements, new tax codes in Congress that would help and encourage investors to come to the asset class. And that's why 1202 and 1045 and 1244 all came into existence. Well, a lot of these programs were before that, but what setting up our public policy group did was to go out and intentionally lobby to keep these programs in place. And in the case of 1202, there was a time going back 7 or 8 years ago, or maybe more, where the Congress that was in power at that time had said, we're thinking about eliminating 1202 going forward. So the ACA, along with our lobbying group in Washington and a couple of other organizations that we work with closely, went to bat to not only preserve 1202, and we were able to point out to Congress the importance of having this tax code in place. And there are all the things that you and I have talked about in this session here in terms of recycling money in the marketplace by investors, encouraging entrepreneurs to come to the table, and the list goes on. But Congress agreed that was very important. So they set up 1202, which was initially going to be a couple-year program, and it was writing off 50% of your gains. They actually memorialized it, made a permanent 5-year program. You hold it for 5 years, you can write it off. And then they also changed the amount that you could write off to 100%. So I don't think a lot of that would have happened without the diligent work that ACA, along with our public policy committee, working with our lobbyists in Washington. I don't think that we would have preserved that tax code feature without all this activity. And our public policy work committee is continuing to work today on behalf of preserving 1202 and 1045 and other tax codes that help our industry. And it's one of those kind of almost a best kept secret thing until, as I said a little bit ago, it's one of those things that you don't really realize until you go through it. But once you do, you realize the fantastic value that this is to both the investors as well as to entrepreneurs.
Yes, and the work that the public policy does to preserve the accredited investor definition, which we've talked about on the show before as well.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And it's something that's been under attack going back to the Dodd-Frank Act and even continuing in the Congress a couple of years ago. But again, through the diligent work that ACA has done, we've been able to preserve that definition of the accredited investor, which is so important to keeping the numbers of people that we have in this industry investing in startup companies.
That's right. We need everyone to come into this asset class because everybody can help invest in the change we want to see in the world.
Absolutely. So I'm hoping that people will, one way to learn more about ACA's efforts in public policy is go to the ACA website. We've got a link there that you can click on that takes you to public policy, and you can read all about the exciting things that we have either underway or the things that we've done historically to help lobby for and preserve some of these tax features that we have today.
That's right. And if anyone out there is interested in helping us with these efforts, we have a grassroots committee as well, a grassroots public policy committee that we have people in their hometowns helping us. So please reach out if you are interested. Tony, thank you so much for being on the show today. This is incredible. Lots of great information, and thanks for being on.
Marcia, thank you for inviting me. And again, thanks for all the work that you're doing for ACA. We sincerely appreciate it. Have a great day.
Well, thank you, Tony, because you have done so much for the organization, and we really appreciate it. Thanks.
Hey, thanks for listening. To connect with me, visit my website at marciadawood.com. And if you're looking to learn more about investing in the changes that you want to see in the world, sign up for Ann and Bill Payne's ACA Angel University classes. You go to angelcapitalassociation.org, all one word, to find out the schedule. Many classes are offered, everything from the angel investing basics, fundamentals, risks, due diligence, term sheets, valuations, returns and portfolio strategy. And for a deeper dive, there are advanced classes which include capitalization tables, startup boards, and exit strategies. If you're not already a member of the Angel Capital Association, you can become one for the low price of $295 for the year, and that will give you unparalleled access to discounts, free webinars with a huge archive of content, networking opportunities, and much more. We'd love to have you join us. All content for this website is informational and not intended to serve as legal, tax, accounting, or investing advice. Well, Marcia, that's me, does serve on the SEC Small Business Capital Formation Advisory Committee. My views are my own and not the views of the SEC or my fellow colleagues on the committee. Our speakers and hosts are thoughtfully selected for their educational value, but their opinions are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the host, me, or the Angel Capital Association, and neither specifically endorse the use of presenters' products or services. Listeners of the podcast should consult their own tax, investing, legal, or accounting advisors before making important financial decisions. All warranties, including accuracy, completeness, and suitability for specific purpose, are disclaimed.